When Hernán Cortés walked into Tenochtitlan, the Aztec Empire fell in 2 years. When Pizarro marched into the Andes, the Inca crumbled in a decade. But the Maya swallowed Spanish ambition for 170 years. Welcome back to the Earthen Dawn. In this episode, we explore the bloody, chaotic sequel to the post-classic era, where steel met the jungle in a war that lasted longer than the Spanish Empire itself. The Spanish invasion of the Maya world did not begin with the thunder of artillery or the march of thousands, but with the silent desperation of a shipwreck. In 1511, a decade before the fall of the Aztec Empire, a Spanish caravel commanded by Pedro de Valdivia ran aground on the Viperhead Shoals, south of Jamaica. A handful of survivors drifted in an open boat for 2 weeks, dying of thirst and exposure, until the currents pushed them onto the coast of the Yucatán peninsula. They were not greeted as gods, but as intruders. Most were sacrificed by the local Maya lords, their hearts offered to the deities of the coast. By the time Hernán Cortés arrived on the island of Cozumel in 1519, only 2 Spaniards remained alive, and their divergent paths would define the bloody century to come. The first survivor, Jerónimo de Aguilar, was a friar who had clung to his Spanish identity with the ferocity of a drowning man. For 8 years, he lived as a slave, concealing his breviary within his rags, counting the days until his salvation. When the men of Cortés found him, Aguilar wept, for he had remained a Spaniard in his soul, viewing the Maya merely as captors. He joined Cortés immediately, becoming a crucial translator who would later help dismantle the Aztec Empire. However, the second survivor, Gonzalo Guerrero, had chosen a different destiny, one that would make him the most dangerous man in the peninsula to the Spanish invaders. When Aguilar went to retrieve Guerrero to join Cortés, he found a man transformed. Guerrero had not only learned the Maya language, he had become Maya. His skin was tattooed with the intricate patterns of a warrior. His ears were pierced, and he had risen to the rank of a military captain, serving the lord of Chetumal. He had married a Maya noblewoman, Zazilha, and fathered the first mestizo children of the Americas. His refusal to return to the Spanish fold was absolute and pragmatic. He told Aguilar that he was married, had 3 children, and was regarded as a leader in times of war. He asked what the Spaniards would say if they saw him with his face marked and ears bored. Guerrero made a tactical pivot that altered the course of the war. Unlike the Aztecs, who were initially confused by Spanish horses and gunpowder, the Maya of the eastern coast had Guerrero to demystify the invaders. He taught them that the horse and rider were separate mortal beasts, not a single supernatural monster. He instructed Maya archers to target the unarmored gaps of the Spanish soldiers and to dig hidden pits to break the legs of the cavalry. Gonzalo Guerrero did not just assimilate. He weaponized his knowledge of European warfare against his own people, transforming the jungle from a passive backdrop into an active, lethal defense that would frustrate Spanish ambitions for decades. While the eastern coast simmered with the slow-burning resistance sparked by Guerrero, a far more direct and catastrophic storm broke over the western highlands in 1524. Hernán Cortés, having consumed the Aztec Empire, turned his gaze south to the rich lands of present-day Guatemala. He did not send a diplomat. he dispatched his most volatile and ruthless lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado. Known to the Aztecs as Tonatiuh, or the Sun, for his blonde hair and radiant armor, Alvarado possessed none of the warmth of his namesake. He was a man of pure violence, a commander who viewed negotiation as a delay and slaughter as a solution. He marched into the territory of the Ky Maya not to govern, but to break them. The terrain of the Guatemalan highlands became the silent accomplice of the Spanish invasion. Unlike the dense, suffocating jungles of the Yucatán that would later baffle conquerors, the highlands were composed of open pine forests and broad, flat valleys. This was a fatal geographical stroke of luck for Alvarado, for these plains were the perfect killing ground for the Spanish shock weapon, the heavy cavalry. The Ky army, numbering in the tens of thousands, was disciplined and formidable, armed with obsidian-studded clubs and protected by thick cotton armor. In a dense forest, they might have stood a chance, but on the valley floor of El Pinar, they were exposed to a force of physics they could not comprehend. The clash at El Pinar was less a battle and more a collision of eras. When the Spanish cavalry charged, they did not just bring the weight of steel. They brought the psychological terror of the unknown. The Kyic warriors, seeing the horse and rider as a single, centaur-like beast, stood their ground with suicidal bravery. Historical accounts describe the Ky leader, Tekun Uman, wading into the fray to single out Alvarado. In a moment that blurred history and legend, Tekun Uman reportedly struck the horse, decapitating it, thinking he had killed the beast itself, only to be run through by the lance of Alvarado. Whether legend or fact, the tactical reality was undeniable. The Kyic infantry, compacted and immobile, was shattered by the kinetic energy of the Spanish charge. The slaughter was so absolute that the local river, Ollantepec, was renamed Xequigel, the River of Blood. The defeat of the Ky revealed a critical weakness in the Maya defense of the highlands, which was centralization. The Ky were a powerful, centralized state with a clear capital, Qmarkaj, and a single hierarchy. Once their army was crushed on the field and their kings burned alive by Alvarado in the ruins of their own city, the resistance decapitated. The Spanish had applied the Aztec model of conquest here, striking the head so the body would die. And it had worked. But as the Spanish pushed north into the flat, waterless scrub of the Yucatán, they would find that this model was useless against a civilization that had no head to cut off. If the highlands of Guatemala were a chessboard where pieces could be captured and kings checkmated, the Yucatán Peninsula was a labyrinth designed to drive men mad. In 1527, Francisco de Montejo, a veteran captain who had served under Cortés, arrived on the eastern coast with a royal charter to pacify the peninsula. He brought with him the standard conquistador script that had toppled the Aztecs and the Incas. March to the capital, capture the emperor, and rule through him. But as Montejo and his steel-clad columns pushed into the scrub forest, they realized with dawning horror that the script was useless here. There was no capital. There was no emperor. The Yucatán was not a single empire, but a fractured mosaic of 16 independent provinces, or Kuchkabal, each ruled by its own dynasty with its own army. the Spanish found themselves fighting a hydra. When they conquered one town, the neighboring province did not surrender. It fortified its borders. When they marched to the next province, the town they had just conquered rebelled behind them. There was no strategic center of gravity to strike. The army of Montejo was forced to play a lethal game of whack-a-mole across a landscape that actively tried to kill them. Unlike the fertile highlands, the Yucatán is a massive shelf of karst limestone with almost no surface water. There are no rivers to follow, only hidden sinkholes, or cenotes, scattered unpredictably in the deep bush. The Spanish invasion force became a slave to geography, forced to move from one water source to another, knowing that the Maya could simply poison a well or blockade a cenote to defeat a European army without swinging a sword. The psychological toll of this guerrilla war was devastating. The heat of the lowlands turned steel armor into ovens, roasting the soldiers alive, while the lack of gold shattered their morale. The Maya of the Yucatán did not fight in the open plains. They fought from the jungle, using the dense thorny scrub to ambush the cumbersome Spanish columns. They dug spike-lined pits in the narrow trails and used hornet nests as biological grenades during sieges. By 1535, after 8 years of starvation, thirst, and constant bleeding, the failure was absolute. Francisco de Montejo issued the order to evacuate. Every single Spaniard withdrew from the peninsula. In a rare historical anomaly, the indigenous resistance had won completely. The green wall of the Yucatán had repelled the invasion, proving that against a decentralized enemy and a hostile environment, European military superiority meant nothing. The Spanish did not return to the Yucatán with a larger army, but with a colder, more pragmatic strategy. When Francisco de Montejo the Son launched the second invasion in 1540, he abandoned the nomadic warfare of his father. Instead, he drove a stake into the heart of the peninsula, seizing the ancient city of Tahoe and dismantling its pyramids to build a fortress city, Mérida. The white limestone of the Maya temples became the walls of the Spanish cathedral, a brutal architectural statement that the invaders were here to stay. Yet, stone walls alone could not conquer the jungle. The breakthrough came not from Spanish steel, but from the oldest wound in Maya politics. The Maya world was tearing itself apart long before the Spanish arrived. The fall of Mayapan in the previous century had left a bitter blood feud between the two most powerful lineages, the Tutul Xiu and the Kokam. The Xiu, seeing the Spanish as a tool to finally destroy their ancient rivals, made a calculation that would doom their civilization. The Lord of Mani, leader of the Xiu, walked into the Spanish camp not to fight, but to offer an alliance. He provided the one thing the Spanish desperately lacked: manpower and local knowledge. Suddenly, the Spanish columns were no longer isolated bands of foreigners lost in the bush. They were the spearhead of a massive native army, guided by Xiu scouts who knew every cenote and ambush point. The tragedy of this alliance culminated in the massacre at Otzmal. In a desperate attempt to unify the Maya against the invaders, or perhaps to flaunt their new power, a delegation of Zhou nobles traveled to the territory of the Kokam to request safe passage for a pilgrimage. Nachi Kokam, the fierce lord of the Kokam, and a staunch resistance leader, saw only traitors. He accepted their gifts, invited them into his longhouse, and then slaughtered 40 of the highest-ranking Xiu lords, blinding the rest and sending them back as a warning. The blood spilled at Otzmal sealed the fate of the Yucatán. The bridge between the Maya factions was burned. The Xiu, now bound by blood debt to the Kokam, threw their entire weight behind the Spanish. The conquest of the Yucatán ceased to be a foreign invasion and mutated into a vicious civil war, where the Spanish acted as the executioners in a family feud that the Maya lost collectively. With the military resistance broken by the Xiu betrayal, the physical conquest of the Yucatán was effectively complete. But for the Maya, the true apocalypse arrived not with the sword, but with the cross. In 1549, a Franciscan friar named Diego de Landa arrived in the province. He was not a soldier seeking gold, but a zealot seeking souls, and his weapon was a terrifying, absolute certainty in his own righteousness. Landa believed that the Maya were children of God who had been led astray by the devil, and he viewed their ancient culture, their calendar, their writing, and their rituals, not as a civilization to be respected, but as a cancer to be excised. The tension exploded in 1562 when Landa discovered that despite mass baptisms, the Maya were still secretly worshipping their old gods in hidden caves, often placing Christian crosses next to idols of the rain god Chak. To a modern mind, this was syncretism. To Landa, it was a satanic mockery. He launched an unsanctioned inquisition that terrorized the peninsula. Thousands of Maya were rounded up, interrogated, and subjected to the hoist, a torture method where victims were hung by their wrists with weights attached to their feet until their shoulders dislocated. Under this agony, they confessed to anything the friars wanted to hear, including human sacrifice, giving Landa the justification he needed for his final act of cultural erasure. On the 12th of July 1562, in the town square of Mani, ironically the stronghold of the Xiu allies, Landa ordered an auto-da-fe, a ritual of public penance. But the centerpiece was not human heretics. It was history itself. Spanish soldiers piled up thousands of Maya cult images and, most tragically, 27 hieroglyphic codices. The accumulated scientific, astronomical, and historical knowledge of the Maya civilization, as the fire was lit, millennia of intellectual achievement turned to ash. Landa himself wrote of the scene with chilling detachment, noting that they burned all the books, which the Maya regretted to an amazing degree and which caused them much affliction. The bonfire at Mani was a lobotomy of the Maya collective memory. Of the thousands of books that likely existed, only 4 survived the conquest era, leaving us to reconstruct a brilliant history from fragments. Yet, in a twist of supreme historical irony, the man who destroyed the culture became its unwitting preserver. Ordered to return to Spain to stand trial for his brutality, Landa wrote Relación de las Cosas de Yucatán as his defense. In this book, he meticulously recorded the very customs and glyphs he had tried to annihilate. It was this manuscript, rediscovered centuries later, that provided the Rosetta Stone for modern scholars to decipher the Maya code. Landa had burned the library, but he had accidentally left the key to the ashes. While the Yucatán Peninsula lay scorched under the spiritual tyranny of Landa and the administrative grid of the Spanish colony, a different reality survived 300 kilometers to the south. Deep within the suffocating density of the Petén rainforest, the kingdom of the Itza remained not just unconquered, but defiant. For nearly a century and a half after the fall of the Aztec Tenochtitlan, the capital city of Noche Petén stood as an island fortress in the middle of Lake Petén Itza. It was a living time capsule, a fragment of the classic Maya world preserved in amber. While Europe transitioned through the Renaissance to the Enlightenment, while Isaac Newton wrote the Principia and Louis XIV built Versailles, the Itza priests were still calculating eclipses and conducting blood sacrifices on top of white limestone pyramids ruled by the Kanek dynasty, the direct descendants of the ancient Snake Kings. The survival of Noche Petén was not merely a result of isolation, but of the formidable geographic barrier that surrounded it. The Petén jungle acted as a vast, green moat, a logistical nightmare that swallowed Spanish expeditions before they could even reach the lake. The few missionaries who did manage to penetrate this veil found a civilization that was surreal in its continuity. In 1618, two Franciscan friars, Bartolomé de Fuensalida and Juan de Orbita, arrived in Noche Petén, hoping to achieve a peaceful conversion. What they found inside the main temple horrified them. A massive stone statue of a horse, worshipped by the Itza as the thunder god Tzimininchak. This idol was the strange legacy of Hernán Cortés himself. When Cortés had passed near the lake almost a century earlier, he had left behind a lame horse with the promise to return for it. The Itza, having never seen such a beast, fed it flowers and poultry, the food of the gods, until it starved to death. Terrified of the consequences, they deified the animal. When Friar Orbita saw the idol, he was seized by a fit of righteous fury and smashed it to pieces with a stone. The act nearly cost them their lives. The Itza mob surrounded them, and the friars barely escaped the island, paddling for their lives under a hail of arrows. The smashing of the idol signaled the end of diplomacy. The Itza sealed their borders, and the jungle closed in once more. For another 80 years, the Spanish Empire stopped at the edge of the trees, unable to extinguish this last, flickering candle of the ancient Americas. By 1697, the existence of Noche Petén was no longer just a spiritual affront to the Spanish priesthood. It was an intolerable geopolitical embarrassment to the crown. The task of extinguishing this final ember fell to Martín de Ursúa, the governor of Yucatán, a man who understood that the previous century of failure was due to a tactical error. The Spanish had tried to fight a land war against an amphibious enemy. Ursúa arrived at the shores of Lake Petén Itza, not just with a roadmap for conquest, but with a blueprint for a machine. He brought carpenters, timber, and iron. And right there, on the muddy banks, he constructed a galeota, a heavy, oar-powered war galley mounting artillery. It was a weapon of maritime dominance, deployed in a jungle lake, a technological checkmate that the Itza, with their hollowed-out log canoes, could not counter. On the morning of the 13th of March, 1697, the end of the Maya independent era began with the creak of oars. Ursua boarded the galley with 108 soldiers and began the slow churn toward the island city. The Itza responded as they always had, launching a swarm of hundreds of canoes to encircle the intruder, their warriors screaming insults and brandishing bows. But the Galeota was an impregnable floating fortress. As the canoes closed in, the high wooden sides of the Spanish ship rendered the Maya arrows useless. Then, the order was given. The Spanish opened fire with arquebuses and light artillery from the deck. The thunder of gunpowder, amplified by the water, shattered the morning mist. The impact on the canoe fleet was catastrophic. Wooden hulls splintered, and the water turned red as the Spanish fire tore through the densely packed formations. The battle for Noche was not a long, drawn-out siege. It was a sudden, violent collapse. Seeing their first line of defense obliterated by fire and noise, the morale of the defenders on the island disintegrated. As the galley rammed the beachhead, the Itza king, Ky The Gioi, and his people made a desperate, tragic choice. Rather than face the steel of the invaders, thousands of Itza men, women, and children threw themselves into the lake, trying to swim to the mainland. Spanish accounts describe the water being so thick with bobbing heads that it looked like a causeway of desperate humanity. By sunset, the Spanish flag flew over the temples of Noche. The city was silent, abandoned, its fires extinguished. After nearly 2,000 years of continuous history, from the pre-classic dawn to this bloody twilight, the last independent Maya kingdom had fallen, not with a bang, but with the splash of bodies hitting the water. The fall of Noche in 1697 marked the official end of the Spanish conquest, a bloody undertaking that had lasted not a few years, but nearly 2 centuries. Yet, as the smoke cleared over the lake, the victory was hollow. The Spanish had conquered the map, drawing borders around the Yucatán and the Petén, but the cost of this acquisition was the near-total collapse of the human landscape. The true conqueror of the Maya was not the sword of Alvarado or the galley of Ursua, but the invisible microbial army they brought with them. Smallpox, influenza, and measles raced through the trade routes faster than any soldier could march, reducing the Maya population by an estimated 90% within the first century of contact. Great cities that had thrived for millennia were reclaimed by the jungle, not because they were destroyed in battle, but because there was no one left to clear the vines. However, to say the Maya were conquered is to misunderstand the resilience of their culture. Unlike the absolute collapse of other indigenous groups, the Maya retreated, adapted, and endured. The Spanish built their churches on top of pyramids, but the Maya simply moved their rituals into the shadows, blending Christ with the corn god in a syncretic faith that survives to this day. The spirit of resistance never truly died. It merely went dormant. It would erupt again in 1847 with the Caste War of Yucatán, a massive indigenous uprising that nearly drove the descendants of the Spanish into the sea, proving that the war, which began with a shipwreck in 1511, had never really ended. Today, over 6 million Maya people still live in their ancestral lands, speaking the languages of their forefathers. The stone cities may be ruins, but the civilization is alive. Subscribe to our channel to relive more heroic history pages and uncover the resilience of the human spirit.